Today on the Mr. Maple podcast, Matt and Tim discuss Japanese maples from the 1700s with their special guest, Dr. Murray.
Hey guys, welcome to the Mr. Maple Show. We've got a very special episode of the Mr. Maple podcast for you today. Today we're going to be discussing the 1700s list. I'm Matt, by the way.
Guys, I'm Tim. We got a great one here for you. We've got Dr. Murray in-house today to talk about some of these old Japanese maple cultivars. And I mean, there's some classic Japanese maples in this. And there's so many great Japanese maples and some that aren't even in the nursery trade today. And we're going to go through and discuss that. But we've got Dr. Murray in-house. Guys, get excited. Guys, go ahead and if you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, give us a 5 stars. It helps more people find us. If you're watching this live on YouTube, make sure you smash that like button. Guys, we put out daily content on our YouTube channel, the Mr. Maple Show on YouTube, and weekly content on our podcast. So find us on your favorite podcast platform, and please make sure you're subscribed.
So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Murray. Sir, thank you for coming today. It's an honor to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I think we've been friends for quite a while. We met probably when Tim and I were really young into Japanese maples. We'd kind of heard about you. There was a legend of you before we met you. So like we would do tailgate markets in Asheville, and they'd say, "Do you know about this guy? He's a doctor. He's got all these cool cultivars." And we're like, I write it down on the back of a card, like, "Find Dr. Murray." So we had looked for you for a little while. And when we met, it was so intriguing, and you really turned us on to the 1700s list because you were collecting a lot of these. And I thought, what a fascinating and interesting way to approach Japanese maple.
Yeah, I remember the day you guys came out, you were looking around, and Tim went over and said, "Hey, here's Taco. We just bought this last week." So, yeah, I think that's on the list.
It is.
So you've been collecting Japanese maples for how long now?
I started, got in touch with Sashika Umehara in 1990.
Oh, nice.
My wife and I had, in mid-80s, we bought a place with some space on it, about 5 acres of lawn, and she knew what to do. She saw it, and
she's quite the gardener as well.
She is. She had a garden in view the whole time. But I was just dragging along, trying to figure out how I might fit in. So I was thinking of a lot of things, and I really didn't have my head around the idea of what a garden was. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm from a tiny rural community down east part of the state. Everybody farms more or less, and I'm familiar with woods, but not arboretums, and fields, but not rooms and vistas and all that stuff. So,
what inspired you to get into the 1700s list? What brought about that kind of interest?
Getting more quickly to that, I think the short answer is it was a filter, because this was 90, and so I'd been kind of just reading this and that, and I think Vertree's book came out in the early 80s, 78. Mm-hmm. It had been in the house for a while, and I'd been looking at his fantastic photographs, and I noticed that there was just too much stuff there. Mm-hmm. For anybody to really get a representative sampling of, mm-hmm. unless you could figure some way to limit it. And I found the subspecies concept very interesting. The diversity was interesting. So you wouldn't want to limit yourself to anything that would cut you away from the diversity of the Japanese maples.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, what would you do? So I noticed that in those little vignettes that JD wrote about each cultivar or species toward the back, he would sometimes mention that this is a very old cultivar, where he would give a date: 1710, 1733, 1882. I think 1690 one time he mentioned. So I made a list. I just went through the book, and made a list of all the plants that had either a descriptive indication that they were old, or had a date that was from the earliest of the 1700s. And I got 20 or 30 names, and that seemed like a nice size collection.
That's a little more collectible than 400 or so that were in the books.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
That's a short answer. And also, this is something that came out later when I met Howard Hughes. I asked Howard one day, "Do you ever get the thought when you're looking at a maple that it's thinking, that its branches are ideas, might go this way, might go that way, that kind of thing?" And he just gave me a dull stare, like, "Are you asking me if I've ever thought that before?"
That's Japanese maple royalty right there. It's easy to see how you got inspired and got into this, and I like that it was so simple that you just wanted to narrow it down from the massive amount of cultivars out there to getting into the kind of the originals, Japanese maple listing. And what's interesting too to me about this is it's by no means a definitive list. You always think of something that may have been around that time frame, but it's such an interesting concept. And I don't know that there's many plants. I had somebody ask me at a conference recently. They said, "Why do Japanese maples have so much diversity?" And I said, there's a 1700s list. There was this level of sophistication and propagation and collection on this genus. In the late 1600s and the early 1700s, there were already this much refinement. I mean, I don't know many plants you can get into where they already had this level of diversity and refinement and sophistication to it at such an early time frame. It's really remarkable.
I called Howard Hughes, but he made it clear right from the get-go that he thought it was these plants had historical interest, but not necessarily horticultural interest, on the grounds that there are many more plants available now that hold their color better, have better color period, actually might be better growers. Just the very cogent thinking that, with time things improve. But I mentioned that thing about thinking. My thought was that these older cultivars are sort of like old ideas. They're the earliest thoughts the Japanese maples had about being different from each other.
I like that.
And when I put it to him that way, I think I sunk a hook.
Oh, you got it, man. Who wouldn't get hooked over that? I get chills. That's a good way of looking at it.
And he began to write about trying to help me track things down, and he was very helpful.
And his daughter married Frank Biles, am I correct?
Yeah.
And see, Frank was instrumental in helping us build our nursery and helping us in every way. Whenever we had questions, we would call Frank. And so it's crazy that, the other side of the United States, and we both had that connection.
Yeah.
So it's amazing the influence that Howard Hughes has had in the nursery industry on Japanese maples.
Oh, absolutely.
He's one of those seminal figures in all of maple collecting. I know, Don Shadow was writing his notes as a young child. I mean, he predates everybody really besides Bloodgood, and I'm sure he was learning from Bloodgood Nursery. So there's tons of these, and one thing I find interesting too, between some of these different lists, I often feel that some of the differences in some of these lists may be different nurseries' availability too. So we look at some of these like beautiful books and drawings, and heck, that was the nursery catalog of the day as well. So some of them may be differences between what Kobayashi Momiji had. I mean, they're around almost at this time frame. Like, it's insane. Some of the nurseries, they're still around today, and they're a 300 and something year old nursery. So they're close to this time frame, if not touching on some of it a little bit at the earliest. Some interesting stuff, though.
And it's hard to have writings from 1710 in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And we're looking for nursery catalogs from 1710. Like, we're not talking about like the Declaration of Independence. We're talking about a nursery
obscure nursery catalogs for one genus.
Exactly. And so this is where this thing just gets tricky.
Tim and I actually spent some time in Tokyo in the book district, just looking through old books in Tokyo, trying to obtain some of the earliest lists that way. And we've been through the Oregon State Archives, looking through Veritree stuff. Some of it he has on slides and discs and reels. So we put a lot of time into trying to get a more definitive list. A lot of what we go by is Hugh Angus and Peter Gregory. I know you were good friends with Peter Gregory as well. Late great Peter Gregory was super influential on us. And a lot of his work on the World Maple checklist, which was just kind of like a brief cultivar checklist, has dates. And so we've accumulated some of the things from those dates in his research that he's cross-referenced to try to put some of these in a time frame.
And when we created this list, there's some things on here that, we know, and there's many things on here that we've never even heard of. And so there's
some things that don't exist anymore. I mean, clearly some of these are lost to time.
Exactly. And you never know exactly if this plant that's on this list was a one-off or if it was a full cultivar that had been produced many, many times in the nursery trade. I know sometimes, for instance, Yano's book describes a Japanese maple that has a variegated sport on it. And there's a name on it, but that was one tree. And so there may not have been multiple trees of some of these selections. Or if there was a few trees, that might have produced 5 or 6 that was in someone's yard in Japan, and then it never got produced from there.
You're also talking about, we're looking at some of these in Romanji, which is the only way, not being a fluent Japanese speaker, that I can get these names to me. And you're looking at in 1688, Acer palmatum Kagiri. So I look at that and I go, that could be something I'm more familiar with as well. Hopefully it was sorted and kept as easy as possible. But, who knows if Kagiri's Kagiri Nishiki. 1688, we're looking at
Asahi. Is that Asahi Zuru?
Yeah. Asahi, Al-Ha, 1688, Ito Momiji. Obviously, Ito's thread, so some type of Leonard lobulum probably, or lace leaf characteristic there. And then 1688, we get to Musashino that you're talking about. So really interesting. I mean, even before 1700s, we get to 1690, Musashiro Momichi, and forgive me on some of these pronunciations, but 1695, Shidari Kaede, and we know Shidari, often means weeping. 1695, Shigarami.
And then we've got Takao in 1695, or Tako. We've got Wabi Bito, which we've sometimes seen as Wabito in the nursery trade. Nikko Kaede. And then coming up at 1698, we've got Acer, and they listed as Shirasanum, which we now know is Siboldianum, a Guruyama. And
all those are pre-1700 according to Peter, but I mean,
and this is even before the 1700s list that we were very familiar with. I mean, this is writings or has been recorded at some point before 1700.
Now there are specific lists too that people typically reference. The one we're trying to kind of get translated kind of has a definitive, I think, 36 that most people consider the actual 1700s list, but there may be other nursery list, was my point, that are kind of like, another competing nursery has their catalog out, and there may be a plant that ends up on Peter's references from that time frame.
Now, here's one that struck me, Matt. 1704, Arishiyama. I wonder if that's from around Arishiyama Monkey Park.
Yeah. Check out our video on Monkey Park.
That's right above, there one time. Right above Kyoto. This mountain right above Kyoto, or is probably a selection around Kyoto named after Arishiyama. So pretty cool just to see that there. And then coming down 1704, we've got Masu Murasaki. That's a selection that we carry today. And then Monzukushi at 1704. I mean, Monzukushi is an excellent Aminum style foliage. And we're talking, these are ancient cultivars. I mean, these are cultivars from Japan before they ever, got Latin, some got put Latin names on them before they ever made it to the United States. These are from 1700s.
And like Nishiki Momiji, we still get that in that form. And Nishiki Momiji being a variegated style, kind of one of the earliest, Arino Nishiki styles. Interesting to see it here in 1704. Nomura Momiji, typically just as Nomura. We don't see that one really as Momiji. I mean, who knows what pieces of these get dropped. Okushimo, classic as all get out. I mean, we offer Okushimo now, and it's kind of, pretty interesting because people look at that when they think it needs to get watered, right? The untrained eye might come up and water an Okushimo in the garden, but it's got that kind of cupped look. And once you see it, someone once told me, it looks like birds. It looks like hummingbirds going to the feeder. And once you see those leaves as folded origami birds, you can't unsee it. It's pretty cool. One of my all-time favorites from this list or time frame is Shiranami. 1704 looks like Shiranami kind of come on the scene. Elizabeth Mundy of Acer Acres got me onto that one. I always ask people what their favorite tree is. And Elizabeth said, you got to be growing Shiranami. And that's been a hit for me ever since. I mean, it's kind of one of those things where there's an incredible tree out there that kind of has been forgotten by time, I think. And Shiranami is just a cool one. I think it has everything people are looking for, today still.
Yeah, it's got that pink new growth. It keeps coming across over top of like a lime green. The new growth can be pink to apricot, to get some yellow greens to greens in there, and then the fall colors can be yellows and then yellow, then change to peach, then to orange, and then to red. I mean, it just constantly has color changes on that selection. And that's a tree that's almost been lost to time if it wouldn't have been for Elizabeth pointing us to Shiranami and saying, guys, you need to be producing this. This tree is amazing today.
Now, I mentioned Kobayashi Momiji being in this time frame, but 1710 is when they attribute to Mukiyama, and that's a Kobayashi Momiji introduction. Tim and I visited them, and I believe they're 28 consecutive generations in a row in that family at Kobayashi Momiji, and they date back to Mukiyama being one of their selections, and still one of the more popular trees, especially here in the southern United States, for holding its color.
Crazy that Tamukiyama's been around since 1710. I mean, literally, we're talking about one nursery still in existence today. I mean, that's been when did the United States come into being? We're talking about a nursery that's 1776. That's 56 years older than the United States. That is insane for a nursery that specialized in Japanese maples and has done so much.
And I think your math might be just off a little.
Yeah.
One in 1711 that really caught my eye is that they listed as Acer Seaboldianum. I think for what I have, and time can change, but I think from what I have, it's Acer Shirasawanum, that Ai Gasa. Real nice rounded leaf form. I have a Shirasawanum of this with this name, and it's a really interesting kind of a full moon leaf. Maybe it has some hybridization, some testing have to be done to see if it has some Seaboldianum X Shirasawanum, because that's certainly possible as well.
Yeah, that's a really cool one. I don't think that one we haven't made that one.
I got it grafted. We'll be bringing it back.
We'll be bringing it back to Mr. Maple pretty soon. One that Dr. Murray, I knew you'd mentioned before we did the podcast, you really liked was that Acer palmatum yaguri.
Right. That's another plant that tended to get some sort of affliction, blight or fungus. But I was keeping it in too much shade. And once again, I had good fortune with this particular cultivar and being able to get a graft of it before it passed on. And then it happened again. And then finally I got it. I moved it into more sun, but it happened again. Got another graft, and I moved it into blasting sun. It's in the hottest, brightest place I have. And it's finally happy.
Nice.
And jeez, I shouldn't say that. Last time I looked, it looked great. Yeah. It's beginning to do something else that Japanese maples do for you, and that is give you different leaves on the same plant.
Yeah.
Really strikingly different leaves. Some are Matsumori subspecies in appearance. Some are Amoenum.
Yeah.
I mean, just perfect illustrations of both those subspecies on that one plant.
That's such a fun plant. I think it's one of those plants that is almost like it may have been like a mother plant from the Yaguri that I have to like something like Gable's Glory. I mean, it gives you some really unreal shades of pink red, which are unreal and unlike many other plants. And it truly was a selection for a unique color on a Japanese maple. And yuguri is such a fun plant to grow, but it's not often found in the nursery trade. I mean, it's one you don't see it that often anymore.
So I'd like to read a few of these that are kind of still around and from their time frame, and just get your input on some of these. We already mentioned Shiranami. A lot of people even list that one back to 1688. Kagiri or Kagiri Nishiki. Pretty good plant. We've offered that one a few times. Shigarami, Tim, 1688.
Yeah, that's one of the first purple bordered
Yeah.
nails, that fingernails on a plant. That's a pretty awesome Shigarami.
Takao, you mentioned having. I like that one for its dwarfness.
I'll throw in a vote for Shigarami.
Masu Murasaki, sometimes listed around 1704. Really nice cultivar. We've offered that several times. In fact, I think many on this list that are still, kind of in existence. I think we've offered most of these at some point. Aka Shima no Uchi, which maybe, you wonder if that's similar to Al Shima no Uchi or what's going on there. The Aka Shima no Uchi. Musashina we mentioned earlier. Okushima we mentioned. Tamukiyama. Wabito Yugure. That's kind of one we hadn't talked about yet in the 1710 time frame.
One that's not on this list that fits in this category as being an ancient selection, but might not have been grafted yet. Nakakomoto Weeping.
Yeah. We got to go visit the original Nakakomoto Weeping, and it's a national treasure of Japan, and it's 400 years old, but it doesn't occur on this list. It's kind of a precursor to Ryusen and Jiro Shidari.
Wow.
A big weeping form there in the Fukushima prefecture.
And it's not on this list, but it was in existence with the name Nakakomoto Weeping, and it's just this old specimen at a temple. And I bet at that time no one would have been allowed to touch it and graft it in the nursery trade. So
had to be a pretty old plant, And some lists have it as 600 years old. Some information. So
that predates this, many on this list.
So Tatsuda, an interesting one we've offered here, 1710. Matsukaze, Kiri Nishiki, Oshu Shidari. We've offered that one several times. Interesting. 1710.
Matsuge,
Shiguri Zome, Monzukushi.
And then you see Chishio, 1711.
Shikage, Sazanami, Kihachijo, 1733. I mean, that's when we coming back new to a 10 at 10. But Mizukaguri, Tsuri Nishiki, Kaori Nishiki, Kinran, Mama, Masukagami, Nanasagawa, 1733. And so those are all ones that kind of date that era. We know things like Sajai and some of those cultivars were around in bonsai. Now, whether they were being officially listed as cultivar use or not.
Now, 1711, I got Toyama on here. And you wonder which came first. Was Toyama variegated? And then they had some reversion. They called it Toyama Nishiki for the ones that were variegated. And then the unvariegated became Toyama, which later became Nancy's Legacy. You wonder what Toyama was, or is this Toyama that we're looking at even the same Toyama that we look at today? Because
maybe Toyama Nishiki, because many of these like Kagiri drops the Nishiki in some of the definitions there too. So it may just be, Nishiki may be understood in the original language.
And then 1711 is also Acer Pictum Akikazi, but it doesn't say Akikazi Nishiki. That says your exact same argument that you're saying, because Akikazi Nishiki is that variegated. In America for a while they sold this as Acer Truncatum Akikazi Nishiki. But, this is a Japanese selection that was made in Japan, and they've got an Acer Pictum Dissicum, which looks just like the Truncatum. And so there was just some, miscommunication when it was brought over and people started selling it as Truncatum. But that is a cool variegated Acer Pictum.
Seems like a lot of times Nishiki and Momiji, and sometimes even Gawa, could have been included or not included. And so it can change the cultivar as we see it currently in, cultivar listings. I mean, easily recognizable as Kagiri Nishiki. If it's just listed as Kagiri, that could be a completely different thing. Same with Toyama. My inclination is to think that there probably are the same plant that was selected for that variegation.
Now, later in the 1800s, there was the Sekihin Benron list, which is a very famous list as well. I know that there are many things on there like the Shigeratsu Sawa, Shishigashira, Higasiyama, Iwajima Sanago that were on that list. And that's a list that's a little more out there and a little easier to translate because, it's, over 100 and something years later. But
We don't have any definite references, but I think a lot of things allude to Shishigashira being older than that as well, but also listen on that list.
And, you know, this, like you said, these are just sort of filters you can play with these Japanese maples. They're filters that you can say, hey, I want to collect this. Or you could even have a garden, you know, if you had a larger space where you had these are your ancient Japanese maple selections, and then over here's my new selections, and then over here's my Go series. It's just like another way to appreciate the Japanese maple.
It amazes me. I think one of the most astonishing things, and I like to get back to this, is that there was this much sophistication and selection being done. I mean, you know, these are grafted selections even back then, or rooted cuttings. They're being cultivated for these specific traits. Late 1600s, early 1700s. You're already at this level of, you know, I mean, this is a pretty good catalog. If you saw a nursery that had this list, you'd say, man, they've got a great selection. It's a pretty good listing of different diverse characteristics, variabilities. There's lace leaves, there's weeping, there's variegated, there's fast growing, there's reds, there's greens. Like there's a whole a mix of diversity going on just within this time frame. And I think it's incredible to see that. I mean, I'm no expert on all plant genuses, but I would have to think this is fairly special for at least the age and the sophistication of what was available to the time frame. Not many plant collections could be this diverse probably in the late 1600s in my mind.
I like your perspective that these were Japanese maples' early thoughts, Dr. Murray. This is how they express themselves in 1700s. And that's such a fun way to look at this.
You know, a lot of these cultivars, you know, Japanese maples are found natively in Japan. And so there is some diversity to that as well. And then some of these are found, you know, naturally occurring. Certainly some of these were selected. Some of these, obviously these variegated ones were almost, you know, picked for specific things. But oftentimes how people got started with Japanese maples were finding these rare occurrences in nature and then recreating that beauty by continuing to propagate it.
I mean, these are the original lists from Japan on Japanese maples. Some of the original lists, some of the original Japanese maples that were made in the nursery trade. And here you've got Oshu Shidari, and it still deserves a place in the garden.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. I really appreciate you being on here today and kind of sharing with us a little bit of what got you into this. I think there's a romanticism to collecting these, you know, these historic pieces, especially for you know, as geeky as we get about Japanese maples. We love Japanese maples, obviously. I mean, if you're listening to this, you're a podcast person who's tuning in for a specific genus podcast about maples. And I think there's a romanticism to this that's really fun. And I think it's appealing to a lot of people because not only does it limit, like you said, but it kind of gives that historical preference. But it does give you, you know, kind of a scale to collect. Like now I think I need a 1700s garden. But it's an interesting way to look at it. But it's also like, I don't know, it's interesting from a historical perspective as well.
So when it comes down to this list, I mean, there's so many plants on here that I've never even heard of. That's going to be almost impossible to try to track down. But it's one of those things where we'll have to make a garden and then leave space for when we actually find these on our trips to Japan, our trips to Europe, because many of these trees, you know, you listen to some of these things on this list, and I'm like, I've never, ever heard of Acer palmatum kaki kaede. Like pre-1704. Like if I ever run across that plant in a garden in Japan, see that plant labeled somewhere at a temple. I mean, we're talking about we have to find these plants not only in somewhere, but labeled somewhere where you can actually see these things. And it's crazy that these pieces of history are getting lost to time. And that's one of the best parts about creating a 1800s garden, creating some of these things, is preserving this kind of history for people to see and enjoy and understand. These plants are, you know, like you said, some of the earliest selections of Japanese maples. This is what drove Japanese maples to where we are today. This is just such an exciting thing. And this is going to be something that's going to be an ongoing thing. I mean, classic Japanese maples from Japan, these 1700s, the 1800s Japanese maples. It's a fun thing to dig into. It's a fun way to look at the trees. I mean, people go in and they love classic cars. We're talking, these are some of the classic Japanese maples from Japan.
Right.
Hey, I really appreciate being on today, Dr. Murray. I know we've been friends for many years, and I just think very highly of your maple knowledge. You've always been so kind with Tim and I, especially when we were starting out, to share your knowledge and your garden with us, and your sounds, more importantly. We've been over to your place a few times getting some cuttings over the years, and I just want to tell you I appreciate you being on here and all you've done to help us.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate being here. I've enjoyed it a lot.
All right, y'all, take care.
God bless.
And have a great day.